Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Missionary Life. I'm thrilled to have Michelle Phoenix here with me today, talking about loving our MKs well. So, welcome, Michelle.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
I'm so happy to have you. So, Michelle Phoenix is a missionary kid advocate and speaker who serves missionary families, and she's a member of the MK Harbor Network, a blogger and author of several fiction books. So today we're talking about missionary kids, which are MKs, those who grew up overseas in ministry due to their parents' calling, who may never have had a choice in serving overseas. This is a subject dear to my heart, as I've seen many missionary friends who've endured suffering on the field and still live with the effects today. MKs are amazing. They are adaptable, thoughtful, cross-culturally wise, and yet many suffer from perfectionism, shame, and are plagued by the traumas from their youth. So in this podcast, we want to uncover how we can be better advocates for MKs and how as parents we can love them better and how they can help heal and recover from their childhood experiences. So we're just going to get started, and I want to ask you, Michelle, can you describe your personal experience growing up as an MK and what suffering you endured from that experience?
Yeah, happy to. I was born in France. My father was Canadian, my mom is American, and they were called to Europe, to the European Bible Institute just north of Paris. So I was privileged to be born in a beautiful country, a beautiful culture. And
Mm,
my parents taught, as I said, at the Bible Institute, which just happened to be housed in a castle. So I literally grew up in a
wow,
castle in France, which is,
so cool.
for the little romantic girl that I was, that was pretty amazing. Um, Going back to my earliest memories, aside from all the wonderful, and there was just immeasurable wonderful that went on as well, the French culture for me was not a good fit. It's a very
Hmm.
fatalistic culture. They look at the dark side. If you've seen a French movie or listened to French music, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I
Yeah.
mean, everybody dies and, the house burns down. Um, and I was already I had tendencies towards darkness in my mind. So the French
Mm,
culture reinforced and I think fed those tendencies in me. My
hmm.
parents were doing amazing work preparing Europeans from all over Europe at the Bible school to step into ministry as people who belong in those cultures, which is so important. At the same time, there was neglect that happened on the home front where my parents were so
Mm,
busy doing
yeah.
God's valid work that the children didn't get as much of the attention as we should have gotten. There
Hmm.
was the French school system, which was brutal. I mean, literally
Yeah.
brutal. They believe that fear and pain are good motivators towards
Mm,
being better students. So having my ears pulled until they bled, being called stupid, having literally a dunce cap
mm.
put on my head by
Ah,
teachers and my friends
it's awful.
instructed to mock me, little sensitive me. um,
Oh.
and there were forms of abuse that happened during my formative years as well, as far back as probably 4 or 5 years old, and then into my teens,
Oh.
about which I never told anybody, especially my parents, because they were doing God's work. And how could I
Right.
let my stuff, which felt minor, how could I let that interfere with their attention being on what I thought was more important stuff? So that's just a very
Yeah.
broad overview of some of what happened during my growing up years.
Yeah, I'm sorry that sounds so difficult. I know you're not alone, though. You
Mhm.
actually talk about the fact that MKs experience many adverse childhood experiences, and you had a quote in one of
Yeah.
your blogs that said up to 76% of MKs who took the test had a score of 4 or more, and that's the potentially most
Mhm.
harmful category for results.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
these traumas shape their lives. And so, what are some of the normal traumas, suffering, abuse that you've seen MKs experience,
Mhm.
and why do they often feel the
Mhm.
need to stay silent?
Yeah, a lot of this came out of Lauren Wells's research. She
Hmm.
she just did some research and finalized it in the last few months and put out a white paper about it. This was research the what's it called? Something adverse childhood experiences. The adverse
Yeah.
childhood experiences. it's a test that was developed by the CDC, so it's not MK or TCK specific, TCK being the broader category of MKs, business kids, diplomats kids, NGO kids.
Right.
But what Lauren found in her research is that, as you said, 1 in 5 MKs is more prone to the negative future outcomes, which include things like medical issues, mental health issues, relationship issues, failure to thrive in general,
Hmm.
and even early death. So I want to point out that that also means that 4 out of 5 MKs are not in that category, which sometimes we focus
Right.
so much on the negative that we forget that there are some who escape this, and that's wonderful. And we need to pay
Hmm.
attention to that as well. But
Yeah.
the toxic stresses that are measured in this adverse childhood experiences were designed by the CDC for people who came out of maybe low income or difficult backgrounds. So there were things like incarceration and divorce and addiction, which don't necessarily apply to MKs. So my theory is that if we actually applied the toxic stresses that are inherent to the MK experience, that number might be higher of MKs
Hmm.
who are predisposed because of trauma to some negative future outcomes. I can't
Hmm.
scientifically prove that, but things that occur in the lives of MKs that are difficult can be what I've outlined from my life, the neglect from parents and
Hmm.
from communities that are supposed to care for them, actual abuse that happens either within the community or within the family and outside of those, the feeling of isolation or never fitting
Hmm.
in anywhere over time can accumulate into something that feels like trauma, and the number of goodbyes that MKs say. We say so many goodbyes in our lifetime, far
Yeah.
more by the age of 10 than the average monocultural person would say in a lifetime. So I think those as well play into it. And probably the biggest factor in my experience working with MKs for now 32 years is the
Hmm.
accumulation of shoulds. MKs
Yeah.
live under this expectation that they're supposed to be perfect and that the entire world is watching for them to fail, and to live day in and day
Yeah.
out, decade in and decade out under that kind of stress and unachievable expectation has kind of the Chinese water torture effect on a lot of MKs, where it just accumulates to the point where it becomes a traumatic thing. Andy Kolber says
Hmm.
that trauma is anything that overwhelms your ability to cope in your nervous system. So
Yes.
it's not that these things in themselves are traumatic, it's how each MK individually is going to internalize them, which is why there's so little understanding among missionaries, among parents of MKs, of
Hmm.
the fact that their MKs might be suffering because they've internalized these events or these happenings differently through mature faith,
Right.
through a lifetime of overcoming, and they don't understand how it sits with their children.
Yeah. And there's a lot of parallels, I think, between missionary kids and pastors' kids, where they feel this feeling of living under the
Yes.
microscope, where they have to behave a certain way, dress a certain way, act a certain way,
Yeah.
for the good of the ministry, so that their parents, are seen as
Yeah.
paragons of virtue in society. And so it puts a lot of
Yeah.
pressure on the kids to be
Yeah.
perfect. And that can really
Yeah.
have, long-term adverse effects. I'm really glad
Yeah.
you mentioned the shoulds because I'm
And it
actually
actually,
going to go
yeah.
ahead.
Okay, because it actually goes beyond the ministry. For MKs, if you
Yeah.
speak to them and they're in a position where they can be honest with you, they're going to tell you they're not just protecting their family or their parents by behaving, trying to behave in this superhuman way. They believe that they are actually protecting God's image and God's reputation in the countries that they're
Mm,
there serving. So they feel like the
right.
entire missionary venture and credibility is on them and their behavior.
Right. Because they feel like they're the best example of what it means to be
Yeah.
God's love. And so if they fail, then people
Yeah.
might stop believing
Yeah.
in God. And so, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
huge weight. And so you had this really
Yeah.
great quote in your blog. You said, some MKs, dare I say, many are still tormented not only by the demands of perfection that shape them, but also by the weight of their failure to live up to them. And so, what are some of these experiences
Yeah.
they might go through that can lead to guilt and shame?
Yeah, I think, well, it goes back to the should. It goes back to feeling like if they are weak or if they quote unquote fail by being children at any point, that adds to that feeling of not living up to standards that in their minds they think should be achievable because they're being laid out for them. So I actually
Right.
have a little list here because you might think, well, I have to be perfect. That's one thing. But underneath that, there are so many subcategories of shoulds. So I'm going to read you this little list. Oops,
Yeah.
just lost my earbud. I'm going to read you this little list just so you understand the cumulative effect of these
Yeah.
expectations that, and I need to make this clear. It's not that parents sit down and tell their children, you need to be perfect. And it's not that
Right.
the sending churches do or that the people they're there to reach do. It's this strange, subliminal expectation that they think is
Mm-hmm.
on them by virtue of the higher standards maybe in the community. So here's a very incomplete list. Be mature, be
Mm-hmm.
happy, don't admit to struggling, be able to fit in, be fluent in another language. That's really big. And for kids who don't pick up languages easily, that can be
Mm-hmm.
difficult. Be perfect, pretend everything is okay, never complain, be a spiritual superstar at age 7, be okay with being sad all the time. That's just
Mm.
part of the call. Don't be upset at anyone ever. Be interesting. Make friends with all your supporters. There's an extra piece to that. Always
Oh
behave,
gosh.
understand all cultures, and be grateful. That's just
Mm.
part of it.
Wow, that's a heavy weight. And, I wasn't an MK like
Mm-hmm.
you, but as a missionary living overseas, I felt a lot of these things. I felt the weight to be perfect and to live
Mm-hmm.
up to this sort of, I feel like as
Yeah.
soon as you become a missionary, you get placed on this pedestal. So everyone, it's this
Yeah.
idea that you're
Yep.
somehow supposed to be, more spiritual. You're supposed to have everything together.
Right.
And so that is a heavy weight. And I remember feeling that,
Yeah.
feeling like I
Yeah.
wasn't, if I messed up or made a mistake, that I was somehow, failing
Yeah.
my board members, the
Yeah.
kids, the women, everyone who was looking at me to be
Yes.
this, superstar, like you said. And that's
Yeah.
very
And you were
heavy. It's
experiencing that. Yes, and you were experiencing that as a mature person with a mature faith who had
right.
already gotten through life to this point, and we're expecting 7, 8, 9, 15-year-olds with sometimes
Yeah,
immature faith and who haven't had the life experience or the relationship with God to find their way through it, to just, buck
totally.
up and get through it. And they just don't have
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, it's just not a fair thing to put on them. And of course for the adults going into
Right.
it, it can pull into it your own childhood trauma, your own feelings of worthlessness, or I have to work for love, I have to earn love, it's not just granted to me. And so
Yes.
that
Yes.
definitely happened to me,
Yeah.
and I'm sure that happens to a lot of missionary kids, feeling like they have to work for and earn that love.
It actually also plays out in their career choices. So they grow
Mm,
up believing, because of all the shoulds, that the only life that is truly significant and kind of God approved is a life devoted to ministry, and overseas ministry
mm,
even better than just ministry. So I've seen so many MKs who God has wired for creativity or for science or for whatever it is, who want to be teachers and dancers and doctors,
mm.
somehow second guess that that is the career they should choose because it doesn't feel significant enough, because your life should be devoted to full sacrifice for the sake of somebody else.
Right. Oh, that's so sad. So, how can missionary parents not put extra pressure on their children? Or is there a way they can untangle some of these expectations so that their kids don't have to grow up under that weight?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's missionary parents and really the whole community, but of course the parents are the pivotal pieces here. I think because all of the pressures are unspoken, the pushback has to be spoken, has to be
Mm-hmm.
clearer than the subliminal messaging that they're getting. So parents need to be really intentional about giving permissions to their kids and then demonstrating that those permissions are real, such as permission to be kids, permission to be
Mm,
immature, to have temper tantrums, to not behave perfectly in public. The parents, of course, there are expectations within the family of behavior codes, but to let the kids know that this is not the end of the world and it isn't bringing shame on them and on God. It's a process and we're going to
yeah.
get there as a family. Permission to doubt is so important for children.
Mm.
especially in those stages of life where the family is facing a big decision and maybe a big transition, to give the children permission to not be entirely on board maybe with what the parents are deciding, and then setting a timeline that allows the kids to process as their maturity level allows, and not with the clarity that the parents might have. So that's
Mm,
permission to dissent, to disagree, permission to fail. It doesn't bring shame on the family and on God. It's part of life. Let's try again and do better next time. There's so many
yeah.
permissions that need to be granted in such a clear way that they kind of out scream the silent messaging that also comes along within the missionary community. And I think for parents to understand that by virtue of them being called to ministry and going into ministry doesn't change who their kids are or what the developmental stages are going to look like, especially when it comes to maturity and spirituality. The other thing that I think is really important is permission to see faith as a relationship with Jesus, and for parents to actually
Mm,
embody that rather than the family job. And that
yeah.
makes a huge difference in kids' even willingness to consider a faith in Jesus Christ. If they see their parents actually gaining peace and maybe motivation and direction and wisdom from a relationship with Jesus rather than sacrificing for the work of Jesus, that's a big nuance that can have some
Mm,
really good payoffs as far as children's emotional and spiritual health.
yeah, that's a really good point. So, how can these children, as they become adults or even as kids, heal from
Mhm.
these shoulds and these expectations that are placed on them? Are there ways they can enter healing?
Yeah. And honestly, I'm still working on it. I'm 55 and still learning to heal from some of this stuff that I've carried around
Yeah,
for years.
aren't we all? Yeah.
One real practical thing, exactly, who isn't? Real practical thing is if your MKs are leaving their foreign field and returning to their passport culture, there goes my mic again. Um, I cannot highly enough recommend that parents consider sending them to a reentry seminar. It's
Yeah.
usually a week long, maybe a couple days longer than that. They're with other MKs who are at the same stage of life, and it equips them to work through some of the accumulated grief they're carrying with them, some of the resistance to transition, some of the cultural biases they might have walking into a new place, and it equips them with kind of a toolkit to understand this culture and find their way in it.
Mm,
This is something that costs money, so a lot of families kind of bulk at it. But
yeah.
if you can start putting $25 a month away now, if you have younger kids, or raising extra donations for that, I will
Yeah.
say that the children or the teenagers probably won't want to go to reentry retreat because in their mind, it's more intense time with more people who are going to become their friends, and then they have to say goodbye again. And usually
Yeah.
at this stage of life, they've just said an innumerable number of goodbyes. So they might resist, but I guarantee that within 24 hours, they'll be thanking their parents. Um, the other things kind of chronically that you can do to help MKs to heal is really to pay attention to them and to give
Mm,
them permission to have needs. So many MKs, I was one of them, at one point decide I'm not going to need anything or anyone anymore because it's
mm,
not going to be met, and I'd rather not live in disappointment. So
yeah.
parents to let their kids know that not only having a need or multiple needs is okay, but that expressing them to mom and dad is essential so that mom and dad know how to respond, right? And what to address. So that making that attention intentional, so the kids know that
Hmm.
this isn't like a fly by night. Okay, now we're going to have significant family time, and it might not even happen for another 3 months. But tonight we're doing it. That for it to be kind of a regularly scheduled. I hate to use the word scheduled, but regularly addressed thing that
Yeah.
the family spend time together. Mom and dad need to embody what it is to be honest about the difficulties of life and ministry to the
Yes.
degree that their kids at whatever age level they are should know these things. So there's a little bit of sensitivity there, but they need to know that mom and dad find things things hard sometimes, or
Yeah.
that mom and dad are disappointed because the whole family prayed for something and it didn't happen. And that when those
Hmm.
disappointments or frustrations or doubts arise, what keeps them connected not only to the ministry but to God is relationship. Because
Yeah.
again, too often the missionary venture begins to look like the family career,
Yeah.
not this thing that comes out of a desire to share the person in whom they're in a relationship with, to share that with other people who don't have access to Jesus or to God in the way they do. So reframing the work as an extension of a life-giving relationship instead of this thing that we raise support for and we leave home for and we suffer and struggle for, that will help MKs as well as they grow up.
Yeah, I love that. I love what you said about, being authentic, because I think that a lot of times as
Mm-hmm.
missionaries, we feel this need to, put on the brave face and protect our kids
Yeah,
and pretend that we're
yeah,
not also going through difficult
yeah,
transitions or hard times or
yeah,
suffering. And so I think that authenticity, to be real with your kids, is so important, to be
yeah,
vulnerable and to share in the
yeah,
struggles so they can see that you're not
yeah,
just this unattainable, unreachable,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
thing, but that you actually have these feelings, these emotions. I think that when you're vulnerable, that
right.
allows other people around you to be vulnerable. And so
Yeah,
I think that'll open up the way as well for them to be able to
yeah.
say their true feelings. And
And I think also to be the same believer inside the house as outside the house. So an example
yeah,
from my growing up years is that my father was very perfunctory in his prayers behind closed doors, but he would go out in public and give these beautiful, like Churchillian prayers in public. And it was hard. I mean, is it performative then? Do we put on
right.
faith in public and we just kind of putter through it in private? So making sure
Mm,
that the faith that we display to the broader world is actually lived out in the same terms inside the house.
yeah. And did you personally go through any therapy, either as a child or as an adult, that helped you, with these different feelings that you
Yeah.
experienced?
Yeah, I did. My depression years started probably when I was about 6 or 7 years old. So
Oh
going
gosh.
way back, on
Yeah.
top of everything I've outlined, my parents and my mom is totally in agreement with me speaking about this today. My parents had a really difficult marriage behind closed doors.
Mm,
So
yeah.
between the French stuff, the culture stuff, the
Yeah.
abuse, and then this really toxic home life. Already
Mm,
back then, I was quite troubled. My parents didn't see it in my youth because they were so busy and focused on the work they were doing and on people outside the
yeah.
home. And I was a pretty good little actress. I could hide it
Yeah.
when I needed to. So it wasn't until my teen years that I started getting counseling. And here's something that I would say about talk counseling, talk therapy, or
Hmm.
even Christian counseling, spiritual counseling, is that ideally it needs to be done by somebody who is outside the mission and outside the
Yeah.
community that the family lives in, because MKs are one of the shoulds is that I should protect the reputation of this entire community that I am in,
Right.
and any failure on my part makes them look bad. So I was sent to people, my pastor's wife, and people who worked at the boarding school that I went to when I was a teenager at
Yeah.
Forest Academy. And I knew that these people knew my parents and could maybe report to authorities about what I was telling them. I mean, authorities
Right.
within the
That's
mission,
not ideal. No.
nothing illegal happened. It's just not ideal. And if
Mm-mm.
it's trauma, there is a place for talk therapy for that kind of counseling, absolutely in any life. I think it's actually a good thing to have um, more regularly in life. But if there is
Mm.
trauma, that kind of counseling is not going to be sufficient to heal the
Yeah.
actual bruising and battering of the central nervous system. So it needs to go beyond talk therapy. Talk therapy will help. It will bandage the wounds. It might
Right.
delay the onset of really serious consequences to what we've experienced. But there needs to be clinical therapy, something like EMDR, which has gained a lot of
Yeah.
traction lately, but something that actually reprograms and helps the brain to heal itself because it's an actual wound to the brain. And there's lots of reading people can do about that to know the difference
Yeah.
between emotional distress between depression and anxiety, which are real and need to be dealt with, and with actual trauma, which is a different degree of suffering or a different nature of suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. Personally, I've been through EMDR therapy, and that's been super
Hmm.
helpful with the trauma because,
Hmm.
like you said, it is kind of a reprogramming of your nervous
Yeah,
system, and that's super
yeah,
helpful.
yeah,
So you mentioned something
yeah,
too that I wanted to dive into about deconstruction of faith. So this permission to be able
yeah,
to go through this, and so I see a lot of MKs experiencing that because of maybe the expectations that have been forced on them to have this faith, and then
yeah,
maybe seeing that difference between the outward
yeah,
faith their parents have and like the home life. And
yeah,
so
yeah,
what does it look like for an MK to go through a deconstruction of
yeah,
faith, and how do you recommend they navigate that?
yeah. I wrote an article about this probably a year ago, and everything I'm talking about is in article form somewhere. So on my website, michellephoenix.com, under the MK
Hmm.
articles tabs, it's all listed
Yeah.
by topic. I think the word deconstruction itself is often misunderstood and carries
Hmm.
baggage with it, on kind of both sides of the divide. My understanding of deconstruction, the way I see it playing out in MKs and the way it has played out in my life is, um, well, I'll actually use the example that one of my favorite authors, Sky Jatani, theologian, talks about. He says when you buy
Hmm.
a phone plan, it comes bundled with a cable plan and free, Apple TV for a month. There's all this bundling that happens, and all you wanted
Right.
was the phone plan. And I think the same thing happens with faith. We promote and we live out this faith in Jesus Christ as a relationship, and along with that comes political stuff and cultural stuff and gender stuff. I mean, all of this gets latched onto the core faith that so many MKs are seeking. And
Yeah.
what they're doing by deconstructing is trying to figure out which of those can actually divided, can be set apart from the faith. They want to go back to the core. Who is Jesus? Was he real? What does he expect of me? And will relationship with him be beneficial to me and to others in the way that I view the world and the way that I care for myself and for others? That's what they're looking for. They're
Yeah.
trying to unbundle all of these expectations and policies, even that they disagree with, and political stuff. They're trying to just get back to faith. Who is Jesus? And do I want him? And in my anecdotal experience, this is not a scientific stat, but I think that most MKs who are allowed to go through that with support from their parents will actually end up maybe not finding the exact same kind of faith their parents have, not the same trappings that their parents
Hmm.
experience, but I think they will find a Jesus that doesn't feel toxic because it doesn't have all the man made, power grabbing attachments on it that they some.
Okay, I lost you
You
there
still
for a
hear me?
second. Oh, okay. I
Oh,
got you back. Okay.
okay.
Sorry, the network is struggling.
Yeah, I
Um,
keep seeing it says network is struggling.
I know. I
Primary
know.
uploads are slow.
So let's talk about some of the positive things about being an MK, because I know
Yes,
there are many,
yes,
and I know there are so many gifts that were given, when we are raised overseas. And so you talked about, in a survey of 1,200 MKs, 60% said they wouldn't give it up for the world, and another 30% said their experience was positive. And then you said
yes,
that's 90% who count being an MK a blessing. So, for
yeah,
MKs that may be struggling, how do you think they can reframe some of their negative
yeah.
experiences as an MK into one of a blessing?
I don't think it's a question of reframing. There
Hmm.
is a unique ability with MKs to hold two contradictory things at the same time, and they can do that. It's hardwired into them, I think, from holding multiple cultures at the same time.
Yeah,
So it's important to acknowledge the hard stuff that we've
yeah,
gone into. quite extensively today, and to balance it, not to cover good stuff on top of it, but to balance it with the great stuff that happened as well, so that
Yeah.
we can address the hard stuff that needs our attention and celebrate the great stuff. And as I've talked even this morning, and this happens a lot, I realize that, oh no, I am giving the impression that I wish my parents had not been missionaries. That is the farthest thing from the truth. I am
Right.
so grateful that God took them to France, that I got to grow up in a culture that, yes, it's fatalistic, but oh, the beauty of that culture too, the beauty of
Yeah.
their patisseries, of their of their
Yes,
of
the
their baked
croissants
goods.
and the
That's right,
brie.
the chocolate croissants. Yes, and just the people are different. The way they do relationships is different, and I love it.
Yeah.
And they're so honest and straightforward, which is refreshing, because I
Hmm.
think in the Christian world sometimes we're a bit less straightforward than the French are. I
Yes.
love that I speak two languages and that I picked up French
Mm.
without trying because I just grew up bilingual. World citizenship. I feel like when I see
Yes.
parts of the news being broadcast, I can recognize places, I can apply a cultural lens to it. One of the great strengths of MKs, whether it be cultural or social, is that they can walk into a new room or get off a plane in a new country and they have this savvy, they have this ability
Hmm.
to observe and evaluate, figure out why things are done the way they're done in this small or large scale, and step
Hmm.
into it in a way that prevents massive embarrassment because they've taken the
Yes.
time to observe and figure it out.
Yeah,
The
adaptable.
experiences I've had, yes, the
Hmm.
travel. We woke up one morning and we lived north of Paris, and my dad said, I'm in the mood for some Baskin Robbins, and the nearest one was in Belgium. So we got into the car and drove to Belgium to get some Baskin
That's
Robbins,
awesome.
about 3.5 hours each way, because everything is so close there. And I
Mm.
think one of the biggest things is being a witness and even sometimes a participant in the work that we're seeing God do. We get to not just
Mm.
observe it, but be a part of it, right? We're in the room where it
Yes.
happens. Um, and if the family spiritual culture is healthy and honest and vulnerable, then we get to experience that as the work of this person that we love and who is sustaining our family and that we go to in times of need and we go to in times of celebration. And so the work that we're seeing accomplished in his name is something that feels intimately beautiful as opposed to this
Mm.
outside assignment that the family is working on, right? So that to have it
Yeah.
all melded into the family culture from which the missionary work comes, I think is really a
Mm.
beautiful thing when it can happen. I would not give up being an MK for the world. As much as there was some hardship involved in it, the
Yeah.
not the benefits, the beauty of it is
Mm.
incalculable. I just love everything that I've gotten, all the positive things that I've gotten from being an MK. And what I do today is to help other MKs to realize that that hard stuff is worth talking about too, so that we
Yeah.
can flourish and thrive in the good stuff and kind of cut the cord that holds us down to the anvils that also come along sometimes with being an MK.
Yes. Yes. There's a certain capability I think that MKs have, like you were
Mhm.
talking about, that savvy
Yes.
of, I feel like now
Yeah.
because of my experiences, I feel like I can go into any culture, travel to any country, and
Yeah.
feel like I can go as a learner and I can
Yeah.
understand the nuances. And that's one
Yeah.
of the things that I
Yeah.
think is
Yeah.
really valuable. And also
Yep.
the slower pace of life, I think also in a lot of other
Yes.
cultures
Yes.
is really beautiful. Just being able to, sit and have a tea with a friend and talk for several hours.
Yeah.
And I know the French
Yeah.
love to sit and drink wine and talk for hours. And,
We do.
it's
Yeah.
so it's just part of it's
Yeah.
interwoven into the fabric of society, to these more slower paced relational cultures. There's
Yeah.
something really
Yeah.
valuable about that
Yeah.
we can bring with us.
And I think the ability of MKs to step into new situations and find their way and assess and all of that is predicated on them understanding that they hold this strength within them. So
Yes.
in the MK mind, we're either weird or we're equipped. And we need to point
Right.
out to MKs that what feels like weirdness is actually equipping for all these wonderful ways that you're going to be using these skills that you've acquired by growing up MK. It's equipping.
Yeah.
So it feels kind of alienating sometimes in new situations, but if we can see it as how can I apply these strengths to this new situation and be grateful that I've got them, that I inherited them from my parents' choice to become
Yeah.
missionaries, then it changes even our attitude towards our differences.
Yes. And I think there's also an independence, that you gain from,
Yeah,
being in these
yeah,
different cultures and being forced in these
yeah,
different environments. You get a strength of character where you believe in
yeah,
yourself. There's a certain self-confidence where you feel
yeah,
like you can
yeah,
travel the world, as a single woman or do
yeah,
these things. And I think that that's super valuable. I know that's been to me,
yeah,
just this
yeah,
feeling of the self-confidence, that you can
yeah,
tackle almost any situation.
yeah. Yeah, we MacGyver our way through life. We just kind of invent new systems and new ways of doing things. And yeah, we have this
Yeah.
creativity when it comes to new situations that a lot of people don't have because we have a broader source to draw from. We've seen things
Yeah.
done so many different ways in so many different places that we can piece them together creatively into
I
something
love
that works for
that.
us.
Missionaries are the MacGyvers of the world.
We are. That shows my age too, doesn't it?
No, I loved MacGyver when I was growing up. It was one of my
Okay,
favorite
good.
shows.
He was on French
So,
TV, and of course, he was called
yes,
MacGyver there. It was
MacGyver.
MacGyver.
That's awesome. So you said that in your blog, families who leave the field for the sake of troubled children too often are accused in overt and unspoken ways of choosing parenting over calling. And so I really wanted to address this because I think this is an important topic about when, as a parent, should you leave the field for your child, and what are some of those warning signs?
Yeah, yeah. I'm not here to tell parents when they should leave the field,
Yeah.
but I hear this question a lot when I do consultations or Zoom calls with missionaries around the world. I'll give one example and keep it vague, but a couple
Hmm.
years ago, a mom of several MKs got on Zoom with me and wanted to talk about her family. They had spent, of course, years getting to the field. They had been there now for 2 years. They were just a couple weeks away from finally launching what they went there to do. And most of her kids were thriving. Her husband was thriving.
Mm.
She was elated by the progress they had made in mission terms, as far as
Right.
fulfilling the reason that they were there. But one of her children had been struggling since they got there, was still
Mm.
struggling. They had tried everything. They had tried private schooling, and they had tried public schooling, and they had tried homeschooling, and getting into soccer teams, and getting counseling. And they had tried everything. And this child was
Mm.
still kind of dying on the vine. And she said,
Mm.
is it okay for us to be considering leaving the field? And the subtext was, even though everything else is going beautifully, and we're so grateful
Right.
that in 2 weeks we're launching this thing. Um, and it happens so often, and it's so difficult to understand logically that the only way that a family, number one, gets to the field is by some miraculous means, because raising
Yeah.
the funds and finding the ministry partners is so difficult. So God gets them to the field, and two
Mm.
years in, this happens, or actually
Yeah.
for the entirety of the 2 years, this child was struggling. And what do families do when a tragedy happens on the field, or when their parents back home suddenly need their presence full time,
Right.
or when they discover something immoral that's going on in the ministry that they're in? What do
Mm.
families do? And my answer to them is, let God inspire your parenting, and let that parenting inspire your decision.
Mm.
So the worst thing that we could possibly do in this case is say, no, the ministry is going well, so we're going to stay here for another 4 years, and you're going to keep suffering. But we're okay
Right.
with that because the ministry, the way he or she will hear it, is more important than your
Mm.
flourishing.
Yeah.
So I would encourage parents to look at the decision through the grid of how their suffering child will hear it and perceive them and
Mm.
God through it. And it
Yeah.
is absolutely not failure to leave the field for the sake of a child. It is loving that child in a way that he or she will remember for the rest of their days. And
Mm.
then, of course, there's all of the nuances. What if the other children now are going to suffer because they're being ripped away from a place that they love? My
Mm.
recommendation would be doing what medics do, and doing triage and caring for the person in greatest need now, and then
Yeah.
adjusting as time goes by. But paying attention to all of the children and to all of their responses to whatever decision needs to be made.
Yeah. What are some of the common symptoms you've seen when an MK is really struggling and a parent needs to take immediate action?
Yeah, the interesting thing is the symptoms will be different according to personality types, but
Right.
a lot of MKs will also kind of rotate through them. If one thing doesn't give the desired effect, they'll move on to another. So a lot of times it begins with isolation.
Mm,
Um, Shutting themselves away, living online, video games. This obsession with video games can also be a sign of
mm-hmm,
this, but not wanting to go out, not wanting to make friends, not wanting to learn the language. I was with
mm,
a family recently who have been in country for 5 years and not one of their three children have picked up the language. That to me is a
mm,
sign to be paid attention to. And
yeah,
sometimes then isolation will move into acting out and deliberately doing things that are so contrary to the family's values that
yeah, to
um,
get attention.
maybe
Yeah,
subconsciously, exactly, or they might think this
yeah,
is bad enough that now they're going to do something about it. But I think
right.
isolation and acting out are two big ones. And then the mental health, anxiety and depression, since the
Yeah,
pandemic especially, are on the rise. And this is what I want parents listening to know. MKs are uniquely good at protecting their parents from their suffering.
right.
So my parents did not know I was depressed even in high school when I tried to commit suicide 2 times because I
Yeah,
was parenting my parents. So MKs,
yeah,
even from a very young age, might be tempted to parent their parents, to protect their parents from their suffering because what mom and dad are doing is more important than my well-being. So
right.
don't assume if your kid seems to be doing fine that they are doing fine. If you see small hints that something might be
Hmm.
amiss, I would encourage the parents to dig into that, and that of course you have to have a relationship that allows for that kind of honest communication to begin with. So
Right. Yeah,
fostering that relationship in the household. And then one last thing is if you live in community, a lot of times because MKs are protecting mom and dad, it might be easier for them to reveal what they're going through to family friends that are trusted. So if families
yeah,
can even go to that person and say, hey, is it okay if I tell my kids that if they've got something going on that they need to tell somebody, that you're a safe
yeah,
person for them to say that to have that third party. I, as a single woman in ministry for 30 some years, have been privileged to be that person, that outsider that is
yeah.
connected with mom and dad and can help bridge the gap. And that's really important for the family to not be so isolated that there aren't external safe places for the kids to go.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I feel like for most of my friends who grew up overseas as kids, missionary kids, they one of their biggest struggles was the fact that they feel like the ministry came first and was the priority. And so
Yeah,
I think that
yeah,
if a parent makes a decision, based on that child's welfare, to put them first and say, you know what,
yeah,
you're really struggling and
yeah,
I love you enough to put you first. I feel like that
yeah,
would just speak
yeah,
volumes to that child
yeah,
about,
yeah,
their being a priority, for their parents. And I feel
yeah,
like that's really important for parents to
yeah.
be able to make that kind of a decision for their kids.
And even if there's anybody listening, parents listening, that they would stop together and say, in what ways might we be communicating to our children that they're less important than the work that we do? And together
Mm,
to just double check and do it regularly. Are we communicating to our kids that they're less important than our work? And of
mm,
course, there will be times when there's some big event happening and it does take precedence
sure.
because you've been building up to it for, but when it's a daily thing that lasts over years, and life phases, I think that's when it becomes difficult.
Yeah. So for the missionary kids and the parents of MKs listening, are there any tools or resources
Mhm.
or things that you'd like to say to them to encourage them in their healing journey?
Yeah. Um, I mean, some of it I've already mentioned, but I would encourage them to speak to people who have been there before them, to older generations who have raised families overseas. A lot of times, retrospect gives a lot of insight
Yeah,
and wisdom. I would
yeah,
encourage them to read a book by Sky Jatani called, his last name is Jethani. The book is called With, and I think it really clearly outlines for parents and for if they have teens, they could read it too. How faith gets distorted a lot of times in missionary circles, and to make sure that they're not distorting faith and who Jesus is and what he expects of their kids. the reentry seminars. There are so many counseling groups now around the world
Yeah.
that can even just assess or debrief a family. A regular debriefing, I think, is never a bad thing, where mom, dad, and kids
Yeah.
individually and together go through a debrief. And there are lists of these organizations out there that families can reach out to. The other thing I would say is for parents to remember that trauma isn't the event, it's how kids internalize it. And if there
Yes.
is something that has happened in the course of family life or ministry that they think might have been internalized by their children with younger faith and younger maturity, to not wait a year or 2 years until their next home assignment. But if that was
Hmm.
significant enough, to get assessed now, because the longer
Yeah.
trauma sits in us, the more impact it can have in a negative way on who we are and our outlook on the world and on God and on family and all of the above.
Yeah. There's a lot of wisdom there. Do you have any recommendations for sending organizations on how they can love MKs better?
Mm, yeah. Actually, this afternoon, I'm going to be posting a video that is addressed to churches and sending organizations.
Oh, that's awesome.
That it's 20 minutes long, and it outlines, number one, why MKs are different from their parents, because so many organizations and churches are developing their plans, their care plans, based on the parents. And the
Right.
MKs are
Yeah.
wired differently and their needs are different, right? So, in the
Yeah.
first 20 minutes, I outline how kids are different than missionary parents, and then
Mm.
what they might need as far as supportive input from both their sending organizations and their church and their churches. And one of the real practical things I mention is financing those reentry seminars for those MKs
Yes,
who are of that age.
definitely.
um, Financing, if they need to hurry back to their passport culture for some debrief, financing that. I mean, there's so many things that missionaries don't do because they're living penny to penny, and that seems like too big of
Yeah.
an expense for them to get the care that they need. And of course, built into that is we come last. Everybody else comes before us, before our needs.
Mhm.
There are books out there that are wonderful. Everything by TCK Training, Lauren Wells' organization. Her
Mhm.
little book on the Grief Tower, and now there's one for younger children on the Grief Tower as well. There are just so many
That's
things that
great.
are out there, but the missionaries need to make the effort to find them and
Yeah.
pursue them. And if their supporting structures around them can help them to find them and then to finance them, that would be hugely important too. And
Yeah.
also, I have to say, go to my website. There's lots of
Yes.
stuff on my website as well on all of these topics, on deconstruction and mental health,
Yeah.
and how ministry can corrupt or alter faith in the minds of MKs. It's all
Yes.
out there as well, usually with a lot of first person stories from MKs who are living it or have lived it.
Yeah. What's your website, Michelle?
MichellePhoenix.com, Michelle with one
Okay.
L, ELE, Phoenix.com.
Yes, and it is a wealth of information, as are you. And I'm so glad that we made this
Thank you.
happen. I know we've had power outages in Puerto Rico. I had
We have been under
COVID.
attack.
I know we've had like a lot of spiritual warfare making this episode. So I hope that it
It's
really
true.
blesses people because yeah, Michelle
I
has
hope
so
so.
many amazing things on her website and things to say to offer MKs and TCKs. So please check out her
And again,
website.
I don't want people to think that I'm bashing raising your children as MKs. Please understand
Yeah.
that the reason that I address the hard stuff is so that we can take some of the power away from the hard stuff so that MKs can flourish in the great stuff.
Exactly. And you are such an advocate for MKs and their families. And I know you've helped so many people on this journey. So, yeah, please reach out to Michelle if you need help. And you can also go to my website, www.saritahartz.com. I also have ebooks on there for missionaries. And I have resources like debriefing centers and counseling that people can check out if they need it. So,
Perfect.
Michelle, it has been a delight. And I'm so glad we made this happen. And I look forward to
Thanks,
connecting soon.
Sarita.
All right.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you.